My name is Evie Robinson, and I am currently studying English at University College London. I took part in the Holocaust Educational Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project 2 years ago, and today I am proud to be an ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust. I remember listening to Ziggy Schipper give his testimony during my LFA project in 2019. Ziggy was the first survivor I had ever listened to, and hearing his testimony really changed my outlook on many things in my life, making me appreciate the little things and realize how lucky I was to be healthy and to be safe. I knew from this moment that I wanted to continue to be involved with the work of the Trust. Since then, I have attended AmCon at Home, HET's Virtual Ambassador Conference in 2020, and written several articles for UCL student newspaper on my experience of being an ambassador and why I am so passionate about and committed to Holocaust education. I have also led a team of wonderful ambassadors on a project updating a report on anti-Semitism in football for the Office of Lord John Mann, Government Advisor on Anti-Semitism. This evening, we will have the privilege of hearing from Holocaust survivor John Dobai. The event should last for just over an hour, and we hope to have some time at the end for a few questions. So during John's talk, you may want to think of any questions you would like to ask. Before I introduce John, we will hear a few words from Rebecca, a Jewish student at the University of Kent, who will share her reflections on the theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day, which takes place tomorrow, January 27th.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca and I'm the current president of the Jewish Society at the University of Kent, where I'm studying architecture as well. I grew up in North London as part of a big Jewish community, so I never felt like a member of a minority until I arrived at Kent University and joined our small Jewish society. I'm the first Jewish person many of my friends at university have ever met, but it wasn't until I witnessed racist and anti-Semitic graffiti, including swastikas on the wall of our student accommodation, actually on my campus, that for the first time in my life, I felt different. While the university experience for Jewish students is overwhelmingly a positive one, unfortunately, anti-Jewish racism is still a problem, from insensitive comments from lecturers, lack of understanding from tutors, complaints of anti-Semitism that were never pursued or taken seriously, and even words overheard walking from building to building contribute to a harsh awareness that you cannot always avoid intolerance and discrimination. Holocaust Memorial Day is an annual reminder to listen and to speak out. At President Biden's inauguration, a beautiful poem was performed by Amanda Gorman and ended, "For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." This links with the theme of Holocaust Memorial Day, which to me speaks to our responsibility. Not empty hopes of light or inspiring words that fade without consequences. Seeing the light is passive, but to be the light requires action. Going about life and deliberately behaving in a way that defends what you know to be true based on the testimony of those who have suffered. Often, shedding light on inequality and discrimination can make the world feel even darker, but tonight's event is a reminder that we made a promise that an occurrence like the Holocaust must never happen again. And yet, we still see worrying echoes of the past in treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China for their religious beliefs today. So, the testimony that we hear today not only educates us on the unimaginable horrors of what happened 76 years ago, but it is also a reminder to challenge the prejudice wherever we see it today. It is our duty to listen and act as we would have others act towards us in times of need. Action to me means seeking out petitions or even writing them ourselves instead of just signing the ones that are trending, penning letters and emails to government officials instead of posting stories on social media, creating events to raise awareness as well as attending them, and using our platforms to elevate the voices of others, not just our own. I know I am not alone in feeling that this past year has been more trying than most during my lifetime. Even then, during a global pandemic, we still congregate virtually for events like today. We still exchange stories and information, and we still come together to educate ourselves in the hope of creating a better future. Our awareness of issues like systemic racism, anti-Semitism, climate change, gender inequality, and so many more give us the opportunity to act. We are the light for future generations attending university. We are wholeheartedly informed and ready to make change.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your experiences as a Jewish student on campus. And I think for reminding us of our ongoing responsibility to stand together against all forms of hatred and discrimination today. Thank you. The Holocaust was a unique and unprecedented event in human history. And tomorrow we mark 76 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As we reflect on this dark chapter of our shared history, we must consider how deafening silence and inaction can be. In the 1930s and 1940s, the world was silent. Today, we must recognise our duty to stand up and speak out. In 1945, a series of notes were discovered, hidden in the ground at Auschwitz-Birkenau. They had been buried by men who knew they would soon be murdered in the gas chambers and who risked everything to write on scraps of paper in the desperate hope that their final words would be found. One of those notes was from Zalman Grodowski, a Polish Jew who was forced by the Nazis to work as a Sonderkommando, working in the gas chambers and crematoria. He wrote, "I have a request of you. This is the real reason why I write. That my doomed life may attain some meaning, that my hellish days and hopeless tomorrows may find a purpose in the future. As we remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered in the Holocaust, we must remember that they were all individual human beings with their own lives, identities, and stories to tell. First-hand accounts are far more powerful than any history book. And I am now honoured to hand over to Holocaust survivor John Dobai, who will share his testimony with us.
Thank you very much, all of you. They may be just words, but I appreciate very much the effort and the meaning that you have put into the words. Thank you very much. So normally I ramble on somewhat uncontrollably, but time is limited, so I will move at a fairly swift pace. Can we have the image, please? Next. So, my name is John Dobai. In Hungary, where we put the surname first, I'm called Dobai János, and I was born 87 years ago, so I'm about the age of your grandparents. And I was born in Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. Next. Next, please. And this, well, you are very well knowledgeable, so you know where Hungary is, right in the center of continental Europe. It's a landlocked country, about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers from here. Next. And here is Hungary's position relative to the countries surrounding it. To the north was Czechoslovakia, to the northeast is Ukraine, previously the Soviet Union, southeast is Romania, and to the south is the fragments of Yugoslavia as it was, and to the west is Austria, and you see the river Danube coming through and then turning at a right angle, coming through Budapest, exiting through Serbia towards the Black Sea. Next. And here I am at the backyard of the house we lived in. And I was fortunate to live on Buda, which is a hilly, wooded part, ideal for young children to grow up in. Next. And the doctors told my parents that the child must be out of doors for an hour, and even though there's snow on the ground, that's what they did. Next, please. And this was the house where on the ground floor we rented a small flat. Next, please. And in the summer, we were, like middle-class families, we went down to the lake, which is in southwest Hungary, and here I am with my father. And my father was a very good sportsman. He played football, had an Olympic trial for running, and played tennis in the Davis Cup. Right, next please. And the next please. Next please. And here we are on the terrace of a rowing club. We're about to go on an outing on the Danube, which could take anything from 1 to 4 or 5 days. Next, please. And if we were lucky, then there was a good snowfall, then we could ski for several days at a time. Next, please. And as you see, that this particular year there was a good fall of snow. Next, please. But the biggest change in a child's life is when they first go to school, and this is the picture of a school as it is today, but it was almost exactly the same as it was when I went to school in 1939. Right, next please. And this is the picture of the class. Boys and girls were educated. It was a mixed school, but boys and girls were in separate classes. The lady with the hat is the class teacher. The severe-looking man on the other side is the headmaster, and the man in the middle is a Franciscan priest who taught us about religion. The reason why I'm in the back row of obviously a Roman Catholic gathering. This was taken after a ceremony called the First Communion, and about 40% of these boys come from Jewish families. And so why do we appear in this photograph? Well, we were born in 1933 or early 1934, almost exactly 12 months after Hitler came to power in Germany. And the parents realized that anti-Semitism, which was rising all through the 1920s and the beginning of the 30s, was going to affect our lives, because Germany, which had a declared policy that the Jewish question must be solved. They didn't say how it will be solved and when, but the parents, not in an organized fashion, but they went down to the local church and asked if they could be received into the Roman Catholic religion. And the parents did this because they felt that the anti-Semitic action will be taken, and they wanted to protect us, the children, as far as possible. This hope, as I hope to show you, was in vain. Next, please. Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it took part in the First World War on the side of Germany. And Hungary was defeated along with Austria and Germany, and the Allies decided to punish Hungary, following the principles of the American president who decreed that self-determination should be followed by the formation of two new countries, that is Czechoslovakia in the north and Yugoslavia in the south. Having lost the war, in a peace conference, the Allies decided to cut the Greater Hungary, that is the red area, into pieces. Next, please. And they formed the new countries, and Hungary lost half of its territory and a third of its population, because the frontiers were not very well drawn up. So the remaining red areas show sizable Hungarian speaking populations who were suddenly found themselves in another country. Next, please. Now I want to tell you something about the position of Jews in Hungary. The fate of Jews in Hungary was almost exactly the same as in Western Europe. That is, they were regarded as outsiders. They were allowed into society when the economic situation was good, but were excluded, told to leave towns and society when there was a plague or a flood or some other drought or pestilence. And following a very early decision, it was the church joined in saying it was that many of these misfortunes can be blamed on the Jews, and this was very convenient. But nevertheless, Austria and Hungary gave Jews freedom about 1876. Full civic rights were granted, and Jews were encouraged to join in every aspect of civic life. Of course, as you well know, Jewish society is not homogeneous, and in Hungary it wasn't homogeneous either. A small minority were Zionists. In fact, the founder of Zionism was a Hungarian. A smaller numbers were Orthodox Jews who felt they were the guardians of Jewish heritage, but the largest part in Hungary were what we call, I believe, we call in England Reformed. In Hungary, they were called Neolog. And the Reformed Jews of Hungary wanted to fit in into Hungarian society. And I was born into a Reformed Jewish strata of society, although I did not know it because my parents didn't tell me that. So the Hungarians joined with Hungarian society, and they became integral part of society in every level. They could do everything except buy landed estates, because Hungarian nobles who held huge parts of the land were reluctant to let Jews become landowners. So the Hungarians got a tremendous effort into educating the young people. And this table shows that what happened. The very first line says on the left, doctor. So 5% of the population are doctors, and yet 55%, that's the number on the right, 55% of doctors came from Jewish parents. So the next one is lawyer again. So all these professions that lawyers, engineers, accountants, bank workers, civil servants, artists, musicians, authors, university teachers, in all these cases, the proportion of people in these professions from Jewish origins was much higher than arithmetically the situation in the population would demand. Next, please. And I'm sorry to say that what in effect I believe was an anti-Semitic law, although many Hungarian historians say, a law was passed limiting the number of young people who could enter Jewish young people who could enter university. Hungarian historians emphasize the fact that it wasn't anti-Semitic, but it was to encourage more Hungarians to go to university. But just as in Germany, the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, shifted the blame for the loss of the First World War onto the Jews, and the Hungarian elite adopted the same attitude. Many more anti-Semitic laws were passed, but we'll come into that later. Next, please. And some of these laws are here. Next, please. So in the 1920s and 1930s, Jews took part in everything, and to some extent, they felt that they were so well integrated into Hungarian society that the persecution of Jews, which was beginning to start in Germany, would not affect them. My father used to tell me, we Jews have to be more Hungarian than the Hungarians themselves. So my father became an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. He went to fight on the Eastern Front and was captured and spent a number of years in Siberia. So Hungary was so devastated by the loss of population and territory that they tried to find allies among the Western European countries, which would help them to regain those territories. And they tried an alliance with Poland, they tried an alliance with Italy, but in fact, the German Nazi Party said, we'll do our best to give you back those territories. And Hungary became more and more orientated towards Germany. And Germany, in turn, especially after the accession of Hitler, put pressure on Hungary that the Hungarians should adopt anti-Semitic laws. And these laws came in 1938, 39, and 41. And the very first act was an act of parliament which defined who is a Jew. Now, my four grandparents were all came from Jewish backgrounds, and therefore I was defined as a Jew and was given an identity card with the large letters ZS, which is the first letter of the Hungarian word Zsidó, meaning Jew. And this second Jewish, so-called Jewish law deprived Jews of positions in universities, in the civil service, and many other high posts. And the third one deprived Jews of even more of their livelihood. Of course, in 1938, Germany became unified with Austria, and then Germany encouraged Hungary to take part in the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which regained Hungary the lost territories, and also the invasion of Yugoslavia. So Hungary was achieving its objectives of regaining the lost territories. Of course, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, At the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Eastern Poland, and many Jewish refugees fled from the two armies which were approaching each other, and they're fleeing through Hungary, and the Jews of Hungary did what they could to assist the refugees. But in June 1941, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and their success was immense. And within relatively few months, the German army stood at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow and Stalingrad on the river Volga, and right down to Crimea and Odessa. And it looked as if, of course, at the same time, the German armies occupied Belgium, Holland, part of France, and of course Yugoslavia and Greece. So the success of the German armies was quite phenomenal. Britain, of course, fought in the Battle of Britain and avoided the invasion. Finally, so the war went very much in Germany's favor, but finally the Soviet armies reorganized themselves, and they gained a victory at Stalingrad when the whole German army surrendered. And the situation was so serious for the German army that Hitler called for its allies to send troops to fight on the Eastern Front, and Hungary sent about 220,000 men who were not very well equipped or trained. They went to the Eastern Front, and the Soviet intelligence recognized the weakness of the Hungarian army, and in a 3-week battle, out of the 220,000, 120,000 were killed, injured, or taken prisoner. And suddenly, Hungary lost its appetite for the war, and it sent out diplomats secretly to try and persuade the Allies to allow Hungary to change sides. But the Germans had penetrated the Hungarian army, and on the 19th of March 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary without meeting any resistance. This is a picture of the Germans entering Budapest. 2 days later, after the invasion, a group of 150 German army officers arrived in Budapest, led by a man called Adolf Eichmann, who was the highest German official who had the task of implementing the final solution, that is the elimination of the Jewish population of Europe. And by the time he got to Hungary, he had dealt with the Jewish population of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Germany, Holland, Belgium, part of France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. So he had a well-planned system for dealing with the Jewish population of Hungary. And it was, and immediately, a huge number of anti-Jewish laws were passed. It was a holiday, and I was sent out to the shops the following day. It was a Sunday when the troops arrived on the Monday. my mother sent me to a shop, and I met a classmate, and I said, I'm looking forward to going back to school. And he said to me, well, he was going to go back to school, but I wasn't, because his father told him that I was a dirty, stinking Jew. After some dispute, I rushed home when my mother had to tell me that indeed I came from a Jewish family. And it was a tremendous blow, because the anti-Semitic propaganda was so strong that I was anti-Semitic. I was taught that Jews were Untermensch. They were inferior hardly human beings. And I cried for hours at the time. The next, please. And one of the first laws that was brought in was the edict that people who are classified as Jews must wear the Star of David. And this picture was actually taken by a Soviet cameraman after the end of the war, but I wanted for the audiences I speak to see what it was like to have to wear that. And it had to be sewed on very well, and my mother took great care, because if a policeman could put a pencil underneath and tear it off, then you'd get a beating. Next, please. A huge number of laws were passed where Jews were deprived of motor cars, bicycles, radios, cameras, anything made of gold or silver, bank accounts. Everything was done to deprive us. I omitted to mention that in between the invasion of the Soviet Union and this occupation of Hungary, my father was first called up to be an officer in the army, because he was still on the reserve. But then Parliament passed a law that Jews cannot be in the army. And a few months later, he was called up again as a Jewish man. He was very fortunate, because his camp, this was a camp of forced labor to build an airfield for the German Air Force. He was relatively fit, and his camp was within Hungary. So he was relatively well fed, not mistreated in a serious way, but thousands and thousands of Jewish men were sent to the Eastern Front, where they were not equipped for this Russian winter, and where they were under German control. They were badly fed, and one of the worst things that was done to them, they were made to line up on plowed fields and driven across so that their feet would blow up landmines. And about 25,000 men were killed in that manner. So I did not see my father for 2.5 years. The next edict was passed that we should be leaving our flat and move into a larger house with other mothers and children, with a very large Star of David on the front. We were not allowed to leave, and neither were non-Jews allowed to enter. One person could go out an hour a day to get food. At this point, we were, the Royal Air Force started to bomb us at night, and the Germans moved an anti-aircraft battery very near, so that the nights were particularly frightening. Next, please. The Germans started the next stage of the Jewish policies, where the deportation. And this shows a picture of the Jewish population of a small town are told to report a railway station. They're allowed to bring a trunk, which is put on the lorry, and when it's full, the lorry is driven away, not to be seen again. Then these the people here are put onto a goods wagon and taken away. Next, please. And if you see that red area in the south of Hungary, I had an aunt and a cousin who were put onto a train at that point. The train went along the southeastern border of Hungary, went north, went through the town of Košice, and went through the outskirts of Krakow to Auschwitz, which is about 50 kilometers west of Krakow. On arrival, my cousin and my mother went on this train for 4 days and nights without food or water. They were allowed once out of the train to attend to their needs. On arrival, my aunt and cousin were judged fit for work. They were separated from older people and children who were sent straight to the gas chamber. And my aunt and cousin were sent to sort out clothes. But later, my aunt fell over and injured herself, and she was sent to the gas chamber. And my cousin survived Auschwitz and the so-called Death March and returned to Hungary in 1945. Next, please. This table shows the number of trains that went from Hungary or Hungarian-controlled territory. Next, please. And the next, please. And the next, please. So 137 trains, each carrying around 3,000 people, left Hungary or Hungarian-controlled territory for Auschwitz. And 437,000 people left in an incredibly short time of April to July, and very few of them would return. Now, when my mother's letters to her country cousin, country relations were returned, she knew that there was something seriously wrong. So she obtained some false documents and took me down to the country and handed me over to a peasant family, believing that she and my father will be murdered, and at least I should survive. And I stayed in the country for a few months, but then I developed a rash, and the woman thought that I had typhoid fever and sent me back to my mother. In fact, I had chickenpox. And my mother made another attempt to find safety for me by sending me to a children's home, and I became quite seriously ill at that point. And I went back to my mother which was lucky because 2 or 3 days after I left, the children were taken away from the children's home and shot. Next, please. And this is just to show you what happened on the 19th of May, 1944. 4 trains left Hungary, each carrying about 3,000 people. But while this was going on, the Red Army, the Russian army, was driving, fighting hard and pushing the German troops back towards the west. And when the front was approaching the Soviet Hungarian frontier, it was clear that the war was, Hungary and Germany was going to be defeated. And the head of state declared, went on the radio and declared the surrender of Hungary. But again, the Germans were aware of this attempt, and they arrested the government, and they handed over the power to the Hungarian Nazis, who were, they were not soldiers, they were a band of hooligans who were fanatic in their belief that the extermination of Jews had to be continued. Next, please. And we were told to leave our house and to form up a column to be taken for deportation by train. And we marched, we walked down the hill towards the Southern Railway Station, and on the way some snag developed and we were put into a block of flats, about 10 flats. There were 600 of us. The situation, there was no water in the flats, no gas or electricity, and the situation was so bleak that a number of people climbed onto the roof and jumped to their deaths. My mother was taken away in the manner shown in this picture from time to time to do floor scrubbing in military barracks. As the fighting was coming to Hungary, my father's camp was dissolved and he came back to Budapest partly by foot. And on the way, he heard that neutral diplomats were making efforts to save lives in Hungary. Next, please. And one of the men who was doing this was Raoul Wallenberg, whose picture you see, who was a Swedish diplomat who issued passports. Next, please. Not passports, but documents saying that the person shown is under the protection of the Swedish government, is not to be harmed. And my father was able to get 3 of these, and also accommodation in a house that the Swedish government and Wallenberg himself had bought. So we moved into this flat, into this block of flats, but we were latecomers and there was no room in the air raid shelter. And the overcrowded air raid shelter, the people there made it clear that there was no room. So we went up to the 3rd floor and found an empty flat where we lived. My mother tried to organize a soup, a way of cooking soup yard, I was told to break up furniture to feed the fire and to look for vegetables which Hungarians by tradition used to store in cellars. So the American Air Force was bombing us during the day. The Soviet Air Force was also active, as well as that, we could hear the guns as the fighting was approaching Budapest. Hitler gave the order that not a meter must be given up Budapest. So Budapest was totally surrounded. And even as it was being surrounded, the deportation of Jews continued. And when the railway lines were cut, then columns of Jewish people were driven towards the west on foot. And this was winter, and thousands died on the way. As well as that, the Hungarian Nazis realized that the neutral flags such as Sweden and Switzerland and Spain, Portugal, and other countries, there was nothing really they could do to stop the Hungarian and Germans killing Jews. So they started emptying houses like ours, taking people down to the Danube. Next please. And they also, the random killing of Jews followed. The boy you see on the extreme right of this picture was a friend of mine, and he popped outside a similar house to mine, and he was grabbed by some Hungarian Nazis and told to drop his trousers. And when they saw that he was circumcised, they shot him and went away. Next, please. The Soviet troops had to fight street by street and building by building. Next, please. And the Germans blew up all the bridges of Budapest. Next, please. And this bridge was blown up prematurely. Next, please. And they were taking the houses like mine. They were taking the Jewish inhabitants down to the riverbank and using machine guns to kill them into the river. And this monument of the bronze shoes was put up a few years ago. Next, please. And Raoul Wallenberg went off almost exact about this time of January to try and get extra food for the inhabitants of Budapest, not only Jews, but others. And on arrival, he was arrested as a Westerner and disappeared into the vast Soviet prison system. And he was probably killed in 1947 on Stalin's orders. Next, please. And we emerged into a burning town with streets littered with burnt out tanks and lorries and dead bodies, and also hundreds of people who were hung from lampposts as people took revenge on each other. But we didn't know the full extent of what happened to our families, friends, neighbors, until much later. Next, please. Until the people from the camps returned and became aware of the horrors of the gas chambers and how people were shot, and starved, and beaten to death. Next, please. And this is the partial table of the number of people killed, Jews of Europe who were killed. But of course, this is not the total losses in the Holocaust. 300 to 400,000 Gypsies or Roma were killed. Children, adults who were physically or mentally handicapped were systematically exterminated. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, priests who opposed, ministers of religion who opposed the regime were also killed, so that the numbers, the total number is far higher. Now, this is really the end of my personal story. At the end of the war, I was sent to a boarding school because of how badly the war had affected Budapest. And in 1948, my father, who worked in a bank, managed to obtain passports, and as he had connections with a British company, he was able to get permission to emigrate legally, and he was offered a job as well. The job was in Tyneside, and the English I learned did not seem to be exactly the same English that people on Tyneside spoke. But I finished my schooling, and I went to university and started work. Now, just like British prisoners of war who came back, we did not want to talk about the war. My father said, "We don't know how much anti-Semitism there is in Britain, so it might be best if we didn't talk about being Jews." So I didn't talk about it even to my family. I married an English young woman. We had 2 children. It wasn't really until I retired that, for various reasons, that I was willing to admit to coming from a Jewish family. So I just wanted to say a few things. I usually finish by an exhortation of the audience that that all religious and racial discrimination is evil. I do not believe that the Holocaust will happen again, but nevertheless, we had the genocides of Biafra and Cambodia and Bosnia, and what is happening in Myanmar and in China is genocide as well. So my exhortation is whether we are talking about discrimination against Jews or Muslims or any other religion or race and color. I had my birthday on the 6th of January, and on 6th of January there was the attack on the Capitol in Washington, and not many, but some of the crowd had T-shirts with anti-Semitic slogans. So anti-Semitism is not dead. I'm speaking to you from West London in Kew, and I have lived in this house for 60 years, and I have not seen any anti-Semitic signs in all these years, except 2 years ago, when about 50 meters away, we have the River Thames with benches, and written on the benches one Sunday morning was Holocaust, 6 million lies. It was the first time that I have witnessed such graffiti. So I'm sure I can rely on you to take up the fight and not to be silent witnesses of anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.